A rare point of clarity appears to be forming around food security in Europe, where the United Nations, through its sustainability policies, has been doing its best impression of Chairman Mao by seeking to meddle in agriculture to centralise it, and in their mind, I'm sure at least, they wish to streamline it. But essentially they believe that by adding bureaucracy to farming, they will make it more efficient, despite that never being the case in any past centuries. Now, we have an example in our part of the world, which is Sri Lanka, and they were early adopters of this policy via their little WEF UN enthusiast leader. And they got a taste of what sustainability looks like in the real world. And, spoiler alert, it was a disaster. Food production collapsed in Sri Lanka and took the economy down with it. Shortly after, their farmers downed tools forever, and the agricultural infrastructure has now evaporated, with political leaders, they're hitching rides on military boats trying to escape the population. Now, Europe, I understand, does not want to be like Sri Lanka. And we all talk about how COVID disrupted global politics forever and changed the way nations interact. But Norman, is food security the real political fight of our lifetime?
I'm not sure. I mean, if you think about what in terms of the farmers, you've got at the moment you've got the farmers' protests which have happened. That happened in Holland, Germany, and now France. Right? There's a perception that there is a war against farmers as a result of the inevitable result of the net zero policy, and that the way, and farmers, without farmers you don't have any food. And of course I think the globalists always saw food as the sort of ultimate means of control of the population. If you control the food supplies, then you can control the population, right? But actually, if you think about it, the farmers certainly all recognize that there's a war against them. They're unified. There's a unified consensus in that sense. And again, we see a lot of the population are behind, do support, the farmers' protests in that sense. But actually, there are very different motivations for the farmers' actions which are going across the different countries. So, for example, the Dutch farmers, that was all about the ludicrous nitrogen emission targets, which was leading to actual expropriation of many farms. Whereas for the Germans, they were protesting cuts to special subsidies, for example, that they got on diesel fuel. And with the French, it's mainly about overregulation. Now, I think it's great that I welcome any challenge to sort of the WF Great Reset, net zero targets and all that sort of nonsense. But actually, none of those protests, or I don't think any of the protest leaders in those movements, actually reject the whole climate change net zero narrative, which I think is a complete scam.
Well, you might have
for example,
you might have a real point there, because I'm hearing a lot about them not liking the taxes, them being upset about being pushed off their land, but we're not seeing a rebellion against the ideology of climate change in general. I mean, the French farmers right now are enacting a recreation of the siege of Paris. I mean, they are trying to starve their city counterparts into seeing some kind of common sense. They're blockading roads with tractors, they're piling haystacks onto the backs of lorries and then setting them on fire. I mean, farmers have even attacked the competing lorries that are coming in from Belgium and Germany, and they famously poured 10,000 litres of Spanish wine onto the freeway. I mean, that's the French for you. What can you say? But Norman, this is skirting pretty close to civil war behaviour, of course, apart from there being no intent for violence. As political commentators, whether you think it's the biggest fight there is or not, is it still showing a breakdown of the United Nations, the Europeans' policies and ideologies, that perhaps these net zero ideas that are being pushed onto us at great expense don't work in the real world?
Look, you gave the example of Sri Lanka. I mean, if you thought, if they didn't see that as an obvious example of why it wouldn't work in the real world, you'd think they never would. But no, they are doubling down, they're tripling down on this. And incidentally, to go back to this point about I don't believe that any of these of the activists amongst the farmers are really challenging that whole net zero climate change agenda. I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, look, they actually want to disassociate themselves with people who actually challenge the sort of the Great Reset and the whole climate change narrative. So, for example, look, our friend Ava Vlaardingerbroek was told that, although she did go to Germany, she was told that she was going to be unwelcome to join it because she was considered to be far right. I mean, there's that. They've managed to the mainstream media, the globalists, have managed to convince, and still managed to convince the most of the population that anybody who really challenges the Great Reset, the whole net zero climate change agenda, is somehow still far right and conspiracy theorists. We managed to break through. We managed to kind of break through on COVID to the extent that we really did change the narrative, in particular with regard to, like, for example, the vaccines, right? So we, despite all their control over mainstream media, we managed to convince the public generally that the vaccines weren't really safe and effective. And that destroyed their whole agenda for having these, continuous ever, the COVID vaccines twice a year forevermore. We did that, but I don't think we've made any real penetration against the whole net zero climate change agenda.